welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History. I'm your host, Mike Allen. It's called Camp Columbia. It's a square mile of a state park and forest in the northwest hills of Connecticut, right near Bantam Lake, which is the state's largest natural lake. Now, the camp got its name from Columbia University in New York City, which operated the site for about 7 decades, and what a series of activities they've had there. World War I military training, college football training on a gridiron, and the place where concrete roofs for buildings were first designed. Our guest today is Pete Vermillier, returning to Amazing Tales. He's a teacher of history at Housatonic Valley Regional High School in Falls Village. He's also a student himself of the history of the beautiful Northwest Hills of Connecticut and has chronicled many of its stories in several books he's written over the years. Pete's going to be along in just a moment to tell us all about Camp Columbia. This week's trivia question. The question is, the first mile of railroad track in the U.S. was built by this company. And here's a hint. It's one of the 4 railroads included in the game Monopoly. Stay tuned after the main program for the answer. You'll know the topic for next week's show. What's in a name? Well, have you ever driven by a state campground, read the name on the sign out front, and kind of wondered what's behind it? Well, if you ever wander off the beaten track in the lovely Northwest Hills of Connecticut, wedged between the towns of Morris and Bethlehem in the greater Litchfield area, you might stumble across Camp Columbia. It simply got a great legacy, starting way back in the early 1900s. That's when a farmer sold about 500 acres of his land, that's about a square mile, to the New York City-based Ivy League school as a summer getaway for engineering students. And for the rest of the story, we bring in Pete Vermillier. He's the author, public speaker, and history teacher from Housatonic Valley Regional High School in Falls Village, and no stranger to regular listeners here on Amazing Tales. Well, Peter, it's great to have you back on the show, and I just have to say about this story with Camp Columbia, an Ivy League school coming out of New York City and coming up to the beautiful Northwest Hills of Connecticut to start a camp on 500 acres with $10,000. You got a lot of questions for you on that, and, I started thinking about it, and I said, Mark Zuckerberg buys a piece of Hawaii and is building his Armageddon fortress there. Everybody can kind of get that. Somebody buys a piece of property and does something exotic with it. That's their call. But an entire university deciding, even if it's just the engineering school, deciding to come out and buy 500 acres of land 125 years ago in rural Connecticut. Let's start off there. What do we know about why did they do this?
Well, Mike, first of all, it's always a pleasure to be with you. And this is one of my really favorite topics to talk about. I think in Litchfield County specifically, we are lucky enough to have many of these sort of unusual historic sites. They've been preserved in one way or another. So Camp Columbia, right, there's a state park, there's a state forest component to it. We see that with Burr Pond in Torrington. We see that with Lover's Leap State Park in New Milford, these old industrial sites. So we get a little bit of that history preserved. And in Camp Columbia, we get this unique story about this university land, which became for a while really Litchfield County's very own ghost town. But there's a long history of this. So Yale had extensive land holdings in Litchfield County. Their summer music school in Norfolk, they had property there. So there's precedent for this. The ball got rolling here in the 1880s when Columbia decided they wanted to provide more of a hands-on component for their engineering students. So they started, searching for this land, and they came upon this nearly 1 square mile on the Morris-Bethlehem town line, right on the shores of Bantam Lake. It starts and it pushes out toward the Bethlehem town line. This became a hands-on opportunity for students to learn. A lot of surveying training done there, a lot of design, but they also tested building materials. So, for example, the concrete roof that would be on Madison Square Garden, that engineering breakthrough that was contrived at Camp Columbia, So that was the basic idea behind it, to provide an opportunity for Columbia engineering students in the summer. I think we left that part out, in the summer, to get out of the city and to come and have a hands-on experience.
I read somewhere, and I think it was your article, that in this all started about 1903, just to put a date stamp on it. And one of the first buildings they built was described as a YMCA building with billiards and a ping pong table.
Yeah, 1903 is when their land purchases begin. So they build dormitories, right? They build what they call a mess hall. They build an astronomical observatory. And over the years, they continue to add to the campus. But they do. They build a YMCA building, as you said, billiards, ping pong tables. So this is for recreation for the Columbia students, but also for others in the area, right? People from Litchfield County, Litchfield, Morris, Bethlehem particularly, could come in and use that facility.
Now, it didn't take them long to realize that they had a fabulous resource in the state's largest natural lake in Bantam Lake. What did they do there?
They built a boathouse on Bantam Lake. This is a time period where, there's a lot of industrial expansion going on in the United States. There's new buildings, like we have the skyscraper is becoming the norm in American cities. And Columbia is really looking to entice students to join their engineering program. So they're building this summer program. They're building this summer opportunity as a tool to get some students to come into their engineering program. So they're out on Bantam Lake boating. We just talked about the YMCA and that entertainment. But this was also the let's get out of the city in the summer kind of movement. You and I are familiar with things like Fresh Air Fund. Now, this is not the same thing as the Fresh Air Fund, but it's the same idea of let's get these young people out of the city in the summer, into the countryside of Litchfield County, and let them use their hands in ways that they can't do in their confined classroom.
So this goes on for about roughly the first 15 years that they're there. They're building some things, getting kids there for the summer. And then along comes World War I, and things change. Everything from trenches to infantry assaults. Tell me what happened then.
So this is what got me first interested in Camp Columbia, was coming upon this part of the story. When World War I breaks out, there are many Americans who want nothing to do with it. This isn't our war. This is a European war. It doesn't involve us. But there are other Americans, notably Theodore Roosevelt, for example, who are preaching preparedness and that the United States needs to be prepared to enter this war at any moment. And they're critical of Woodrow Wilson's government for, they would say, putting their head in the sand and ignoring the fact that there's this enormous war that at any moment the United States could be in, and his government's doing nothing to get them ready. Right? That would be the criticism. So it becomes very fashionable, especially in Ivy League universities, not just Ivy League, but the elite universities and colleges in the United States, for the young men to begin programs of military preparedness with the idea that they will do the training, they will understand how the military works, because these naturally will be the leaders and the officers in the expanded army when, I should say if, but they would have said when the U.S. entered the war. And so even before the U.S. is involved, you see Columbia University students undergoing military training, preparedness training, just in case. And the place they do that is Camp Columbia. And so they went out there and said, we need to prepare these men for the World War I landscape. So they dug trenches. I went out there with my young sons. They were young at the time. Now they're in their 20s, but they were young at the time. We went out to find, can we find any remnants? We had a map. And I think we may have, I don't want to definitively say we did, but they dug World War I style entrenchments out there to lead mock infantry assaults against these trenches. In 1918, the university sent out an informational packet for anyone. So they did that for the first time in 1917. And then the next year they said, we're going to do it again. They sent out an informational packet saying that they were going to offer an officer's training course for men who may be called to the National Army. And it was run by the university, not by the Army. but it was endorsed by the Secretary of War. And by this point, the war is going on. And so they have this seal of approval, not just from the Secretary of War, but also, and here's a quote from their pamphlet, the record of the men who attended last summer shows that the course has been effective in preparing men for officer's rank, real usefulness, and rapid advancement. So they're selling this program. The war's here now, 1918, the war's here. And if you want to go in with the background and training to be an officer and to rapidly advance, this is what you want to come and do.
Now the war ends and they go back to more or less educational activities, and they do things like they build a fieldstone dining house. And one of the things that still stands there, and it's one of the highlights of the site, is this cylindrical water tower that's 60 feet high. What's the story behind that?
You can find some old pictures of Camp Columbia with a generic water tower, the kind that, looks like you would find at any train station in 1900 America. But these are engineering students, and they get the Columbia class of 1906 donates the money to build this stone tower, cylindrical staircases that sweeps to the top of it with an observation platform. One person called it a landlocked lighthouse. Another person called it the battlement of a feudal castle. What's really kind of cool about it, and again, this is still there today. Not only is it still there, but it's been improved over the last, say, 20 years. You used to not be able to go in it, but now you can. You can go inside and you go up the spiral staircase. And when you get to a certain height near the top, the stairs come outside. And then you're outside spiraling around the water tower to the platform. And then, if you catch it like this time of year, right now here in October, the view is stunning of the foliage.
Engineering students anywhere, but especially at Columbia with the quality of folks they have there, they didn't just stop, there with these kinds of projects. They actually did some blasting, and they kind of leveled the terrain so they could put in a softball field and a football field. And let's focus on football for a second, because this drew their college football team out to Morris and Bethlehem during the preseason. Tell us that story.
So again, like we see this, I think, commonly with the NFL today. Most of these NFL teams, they don't have their preseason practicing at their regular season playing facility. They have, at least in the not so distant past, used college campuses to get their team together. They put them up in dorms, all of that. And that's what Columbia University was doing starting in the late 1940s. Holding their early season practices there. Their coach was Lou Little, who's a member of the College Football Hall of Fame. And, he would take the team out there to have their early season practices, to get them away from the distractions, to have team building. They're living together, they're eating together, they're wandering the trails and the woods in their free time, as Little as molding them into the Columbia teams of the late 40s and the early 50s. And one particular part of the story that I like is that Lou Little was friends with the new late 1940s Columbia president, Dwight Eisenhower. And so, Dwight Eisenhower is reported to have come out to Camp Columbia to watch his team have their practices and then go out hunting on university grounds there in Morris and Bethlehem.
One of the things that happened here at Camp Columbia in the late 50s was they offered an English course designed for international students. And at one point, they had quite a showing there, didn't they?
They did. And so I'm speaking to you right now from Housatonic Valley Regional High School in Falls Village. We had one of the first chapters of the American Field Service, or the AFS, designed for international cooperation. This was a big theme after World War II. Let's get transfer students, exchange students. Let's get young people traveling around the world, meeting other people. That will promote peace. That will promote goodwill. And that's what Columbia University is doing. This would be Columbia's American Language Center, and they offer classes to international students. Interestingly, students who want to study at American colleges, but not just Columbia. right? Any American college. 1952, there were about 60 international students. They were from, countries like Japan and China and Korea and Malaya. They were from Norway and Sweden. They were from Greece. They were from Canada. They were from Colombia, from Brazil. So we had all the corners of the globe covered here. So much so that somebody said that Camp Columbia was a veritable United Nations in microcosm, that the students lived together, worked together, and they say with no more friction than we would find in any other college class.
The country changed a lot in the 60s, and so it was the 1960s when the student interest in this camping experience started to decline. And, they changed the curriculum a little bit at Columbia for the engineering school. But basically, long story short, it started to dwindle. And finally, by 1983, they closed Camp Columbia and couldn't find a buyer. What happened to the site after that?
Yeah, so they do bring about changes to their curriculum as the computer starts to play a bigger part in engineering. They don't have the infrastructure out there at Camp Columbia to do this. The university does maintain the property. Well, they continue to use the property until 1983. They use it for special programming, sort of like university leadership retreats. They would go out to the site and hold meetings there for the same reason that the football team did, to get away from the distractions. But all that time, the university is looking to sell it, and they can't find a buyer. Finally, in 1989, the town of Morris has to step in. In essence, they have to condemn some of the buildings, declare them to be public hazard, and they actually do a controlled burning exercise with some of those buildings. So in 2000, the state of Connecticut stepped in and agreed to purchase the grounds for a little bit over $2 million. And the state of Connecticut slowly but surely started to remove some of the buildings. There's a part of it, sort of the central part of the campus, if you will, was maintained or is still called Camp Columbia State Park. There's a little historic element to it. And then the broader expanse of the square mile is the Camp Columbia State Forest. When I first went out there, probably 25 years ago, there were remnants of the instrument house, for example. There were some foundations, of course, the tower, but that instrument house is no longer there. That was incredibly unsafe. So we're all better off. But the foundations are there. Particularly evocative is that you can find, if you're willing to poke around in the brush a little bit, you can find the ring of stones that encircled the flagpole in the center of the campus.
Otherwise, the former ghost town of structures is whittled down to primarily the water tower and the remaining foundations. Of course, all the beautiful land is still there. Now, there used to be 3 well-maintained loop trails traversing the site through the stone foundations and around the rest of the territory. You could run around them. If you piece them all together, those 3 loops, you'd get a 5-mile jogging trail. Well, you might not find them as well-maintained today as they used to be with all the budget cuts and all, but the main path from the parking lot to the stone tower, well, it's in great shape. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Pete Vermillier. He's the wonderful historian, author, and teacher from Northwest Connecticut who knows the history of that region of the state better than anybody else I know. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, the first mile of railroad track in the U.S. was built by this company, and a hint was that one of the 4 railroads included in the game Monopoly was that railroad. Well, the answer is it was the B&O Railroad, also known as the Baltimore and Ohio, and the first mile of track began in Baltimore and headed west. Next week on Amazing Tales, we're coming up on the 200th anniversary of railroading. Now, that's a subject near and dear to my heart personally, so we're going to take a look back with the head of the B&O Museum, and they are the keepers of the artifacts of where the first commercial railroad in the U.S. began. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.